Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we have the wondrous opportunity to interview Leanne Townsend. Leanne is the founder of Wild Food Stories, which sees her leading a variety of courses, workshops, and events throughout the year in Aberdeenshire and throughout Scotland. As a wild food specialist, she works with a number of local, national, and international organizations to provide consultations. When not sharing her love of wild foods with groups and communities, she also leads academic research on wild food culture and practices in the UK and worldwide. Through her deep explorations of the vital connection to nature that foraging can provide, in combination to her research on wild food cultures and traditions, she brings to bear some sage insights when it comes to our modern wild food story. Coming to us from rural Scotland, Leanne, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
I was really excited when you reached out to me, not only because I love interviewing people from the UK for their gorgeous accents, but also because you're actually in Scotland, which I think is an interesting area in general. I visited there when I was young. I think it's super interesting, and I'm excited to learn about the foraging culture there.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I've been in Scotland now for over 20 years. I don't originally come from Scotland, but I would say I am of Scotland now. So yeah, so you don't get the Scottish accent, but you get the insights, I guess.
Yeah, I think you've become of that land once you've lived there that long. And actually, I want to get into that a little bit, is kind of your origin story, a little bit about how you came to where you are today. So I guess in terms of your family, you said you come from England or the UK. Did your family have any interest in wild food or foraging or anything like that?
Well, kind of. We weren't fully immersed in it. I grew up, I was born in Yorkshire in the north of England.
Okay.
And I grew up, the first part of my life, I grew up in a seaside town. And I used to spend a lot of time with my gran. She helped raise me, my grandmother. And we used to go for wildflower walks and things like that. We used to go bramble foraging, blackberries, and then bring them home and make crumbles and things like that with them,
Amazing.
Sort of that level of foraging. She came from a very rural village kind of background, so she probably inherited that from her upbringing and passed it on to me.
Do you think that's something, just as a quick aside, do you think that's something that's, kind of in the domain, in terms of foraging, do you think it's something that's kind of passed down as like almost a female tradition? The only reason I ask is a lot of women I've interviewed on the podcast seem to have some matriarchal figure, whether it's a mother or grandmother, that passed down either a knowledge of herbs or a basic knowledge of foraging. Do you think that's something we can attribute as kind of a female tradition, maybe historically, or maybe just in an anecdotal sense? I mean, is this something that gets passed down through the female side a lot of the time?
I think certainly to an extent it is. Definitely when you're thinking about kind of those generations as well, then the kitchen in the UK at least, I would argue has probably been a female domain until more recent generations, if that makes sense. So yeah, my granddad wasn't really interested in it and actually never made anything in the kitchen. So, but my gran, she was also a really keen gardener. She grew her own food. And I'm not sure how typical that was for that community, but something that she brought with her from this rural area, yeah.
What did you end up studying in school? Did you take that interest, and was that somehow reflected into what you studied or what you worked in?
No, not at all. Well, one thing, I don't know if it's significant, but my parents, we moved around a lot. They were moving around for work around the north of England. We travelled around different parts of Yorkshire. We were in County Durham, which is near Newcastle, eventually ending up in Scotland. And sort of throughout that time of moving around, moving schools, moving homes, sometimes we lived in rural places, sometimes we didn't. But I know, I'm quite clear that I was more happy when we lived in rural places. Mm-hmm. So even though I hadn't necessarily come from that background, I always felt happier in a rural setting. That was always my goal as a young adult, to get out here into the countryside as soon as I could. And luckily, my now husband shared that sentiment. At university, I actually studied psychology.
Okay.
And then I went on to do a PhD, which was a bit more like human geography, if you like, looking at the meaning of home. A bit different, taking a slightly different avenue from the psychology there. And then went on to be a researcher of rural communities and rural economies. Wow. So it's not like my training or my research career is about sort of natural sciences of the environment.
Right.
And there was a big period, I suppose, when I wasn't really foraging. It just kind of came back to me by a number of interesting kind of little routes.
Yeah, well, what were those little synchronicities or things that kind of brought you back out into the wilds looking for food?
Yeah, well, so we moved here, must have been around 16, 17 years ago. We moved out to the countryside. We live in Donside, which is in West Aberdeenshire.
Okay.
And as I say, you know, we had a really deep desire to do that. We made it happen. We grow our own foods, but at that point I wasn't foraging. But we're really lucky in this local area. There's a lot of birch woodland, a lot of pine. And in the birch woods, we have some of the most abundant chanterelles that you'll find anywhere, I think, in the world, potentially. I mean, we're so lucky here.
Wow, in the birch woods?
In the birch woods especially. Okay. They will sometimes grow in pine as well. Okay. And they like pine and birch mix. They love that as well. And I suppose if local people know any mushroom, it's that one. But even so, that would still be a minority of local people that are brave enough or knowledgeable enough, I suppose, to forage them. But somebody did say to me, yeah, that they are chanterelles. And I think I brought a few home and looked in a book. And yeah, nailed it. Okay. And so that added something gourmet to the table for quite a few years. It never even occurred to me to branch out from that. Until one day, a colleague from university, a sociology professor, a friend of mine came. She said, "Oh, I love chanterelles. Can I come with you?" And I said, "Of course." But she brought with her her friend who was from the Czech Republic. Mm-hmm. And we were walking. I thought we were just going to pick chanterelles that day, you know, with my basket. And this lady, Terry, from the Czech Republic, where, although it's a stereotype, a positive stereotype, Eastern Europeans are amazing. They really know their mushrooms.
Right.
And she was just leaping about, picking all kinds of amazing things, going, "Oh, this is a sap, and this is a birch bolete," and, you know, I said, "What? This is a parasol?" I said, "You're kidding. You can eat those things." I don't know, for some reason, I stuck with chanterelles. I played it safe. Didn't really occur to me to branch out from that. Until that day, and she just opened my eyes, and I brought my basket home. She told me everything's safe, but I thought, I didn't know her very well, so I went online. I found online groups, communities. I dug out books, and it was just that was the day that changed everything. And after that, I've been completely obsessed. So mushrooms have been my first love.
Wow. What a seminal day. I mean, getting stuck in chanterelles is not a bad place to be. I can see why you're kind of like, I don't need to explore outside this because I love chanterelle. But that's really a powerful moment when someone kind of opens up the universe, and then obviously smart to do your own research before taking someone's word for it. And just amazing how that lights the fire in your brain to start exploring. And now there is so much information out there where you just fall down the rabbit hole. And that's something I'll often tell people when they ask me, you know, how do I learn about mushrooms? You just find a crevice to get in and you just fall into it. Like you don't have to come into it trying to have an expansive knowledge of everything, because that's impossible. Fungi is 2 million different organisms. It's, you know, you're never going to know it all. So
exactly, it's
not being afraid to like just get inspired and follow where that leads. And before you know it, you'll be the mushroom person in your group, in your community.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's exactly how it happened, you know, and then I suppose fast forward a couple of years of finding, you know, that frustration. I don't know if you feel it too when the season ends and you have that long wait and you're kind of itching for that kind of interaction with the natural world, you know. It's not just about the food that gets put on the table at the end of the day. And And because I think I do owe a lot of it to some of the online communities that I found, and the kind of mutual exchange and the sharing and so on, because that opened my eyes to the wider food world of wild food, and the plants and the nuts and fruits and the roots and the seeds. And so that gave me an even bigger world to delve into, which will never end. I mean, even as a foraging instructor of several years, there's no way that I'll know everything ever, because each area has its specific ecosystem, right? And so it favors certain plants or more or less of certain things. And so you just need to go somewhere new, and you're on that learning curve right over again.
Yeah. I think that's one thing that you realize when you start foraging. A term coined by Breakfast of Champions, and I don't know if you follow her on social media. Anyway, she says, always be looking, always be learning. And that is kind of what you realize when you're foraging, is you always got to be open. There's always going to be more to learn. And
humble.
Absolutely. You have to be humble. And I think, being part of community, finding that community that you're able to connect with really does exponentially increase your learning, especially when you come to it with that humble mindset of, hey, I realize I don't know anything. What can you guys teach me? It really, people then open up and start kind of telling you everything. That's the other thing I inform a lot of people about, is if you connect with a local foraging community, a mycology community, even online communities, people want to share this information. They want to inoculate you with a love of wild mushrooms. So it's really easy to start connecting with people. I've found, at least in my experience, it's really easy to start connecting with people. And that's when you really start learning. Now, did you have any, obviously there's the woman from the Czech Republic that was kind of one of your mentors that kind of kicked it all off. But did you have any other in-person mentors or any in-person groups there in the rural area you are in, or did you have to find more connection with the online community?
No, not really. I think, maybe I should have mentioned earlier when we were talking about whether the heritage and the learning of foraging gets passed down. Right. I think it does, but I think in the UK, we're not really, we don't have that heritage, or we've lost that connection. Right. So you find that you're in a minority. I think there's one or two people locally that I maybe chatted to, but that would forage for this and that, but no, my community that I found was online. And it went from being an online community and interaction to me then making friends with people in real life. Apart from the fact that I'm now a member of the Association of Foragers for a couple of years, which is a fantastic organization, but also some more, meaningful friendships have emerged from this over the years. And now I have Lisa from Eduless Wild Food. You've probably seen her on Instagram.
Yeah, of course.
You've interacted with her. So she comes up, she makes a bit of a pilgrimage up to Scotland every year in her van, and we nab her for a good few days, and Lisa and I just go off into the woods for days. It is all about community, but for me, I needed to just reach out a bit further afield in order to find that.
That's the beauty of technology, is we are able to integrate with new communities, and inevitably that turns into, or at least in the best case scenarios, that turns into in-person meetings and creating real bonds and real friendships. And I think that is one of the key elements of foraging, really, is being able to connect with people and have a similar kind of ancient bonding experience of going out in the wild and finding something to eat. Basically, that's what we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years.
Exactly. And it's about reconnecting with that. But I must say that I'm lucky now to have found a couple of local, similarly to me, foraging instructors, and that's come about through the Association of Foragers group as well.
That begs the question, what is the Association of Foragers?
So the Association of Foragers it's actually global, although I would say that the majority of members are based in the UK, but we're starting to kind of gain membership from other parts of the world, which is great. And it's an association for people who are professionally embedded in the world of wild food and drink. So you have anything from, I mean, a lot of the UK-based and even overseas foraging instructors are members of the association. We have herbalists who, forage for medicine. We've got people who have wild drink companies like liqueurs that are, and gins and all kinds of things that are flavored with wild botanicals. There are people that run wild supper clubs. There are people who provide wild food to restaurants. So it's that whole kind of range of wild food professionals. But at the same time, we have this shared ethos, which is about reaching out and getting more people connected to nature. And the Association of Foragers has a bit of a tagline, which is restoring vital connection, which I think, the members generally all relate to that and go out there and do that in their daily work.
Well, and it's something I talk about a lot on this podcast is how foraging ends up, restoring that connection. And I often talk about in the context of kind of our crazy modern world where we're always distracted, we have limited time. So sometimes it's hard for people to just go out and say, I'm going to spend 3 hours walking in the woods. Not for everyone, but for people who are busy, they have kids, they have jobs. It's like, do I really have 3 hours to spend? But when you couple it with something that has kind of a reward at the end of it, suddenly it becomes easier to spend more. Before you know it, you're spending more time out in nature and you're just forcing yourself almost to develop that intimate connection with nature that we all need. And once you realize it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is the thing that I was missing. This is the thing that I really needed to kind of balance myself out, because out in nature, you don't have all the low level stresses you have in just being in a city or being at work. So it really is able to kind of cleanse you in a lot of ways. So I think reestablishing that vital connection is so key. And something else you mentioned when we were chatting on Instagram is reestablishing that vital connection, creating foragers creates people that are more mindful of nature. And when we all know about the problems that we face in the world, creating groups of people that have an intimate connection with nature, therefore are more cognizant of protecting nature, is such a critical thing.
Absolutely agree with you. Yeah. I think, as you say, we've become increasingly industrialized and people now no longer connect with nature. Well, a lot of people don't find themselves on a daily basis connecting with nature in a meaningful way. And I think that the difference that people tend to experience, people that have come on my course, myself with my own personal journey as well, is that there's a difference between, going out. I mean, I absolutely applaud people going out and walking and or just taking in the nice view, having a nice drive. Right. I think there's a big difference. And I think it comes down to the fact that we are actually physically and emotionally interacting with this ecosystem, with this habitat that's around us. And foraging, it sort of compels you to learn so much more, not just about the mushrooms that you're seeking, but you need to understand how to identify the trees. You start to learn what kind of land is going to be more likely to have certain things that you're searching for. Is it damp over there? Will I find my mushrooms over there? I'll follow this path. And before you know it, you have this meaningful connection, which I think is so much more restorative and good for your well-being than just, for myself, maybe not for everyone, but for myself, I've lived out in the countryside for years, but for some of that time, I was taking my dogs out and walking. I'm sure it was good for me. I'm sure it helped me to switch off. But I would still be sometimes thinking, there's that deadline at work, and I didn't do that, and oh my God, I didn't reply to the email. But when you're foraging, you're distracted in a good way. And you're connecting into a system that we all belong to. Yeah. But we've been somehow removed from, I could talk about this all day, but I just think it's incredibly important, the reasons you gave, especially given the way that everything is going with the environment and with the climate and so on. The more custodians or ambassadors of these habitats that we can sort of foster, the better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it is one of those things that forces you to be present out in nature. Like you're saying, it's so easy to go out, when we walk our dogs, whatever, we're totally not present, or at least I find myself not being present. I'm thinking about something. I'm a million miles away. Whereas when you're foraging, you're looking for something, you are totally present. You are seeing, smelling, hearing everything around you. And it is such a crucial experience for humans. We are of nature and therefore need to reconnect with nature on a regular basis. And I've also talked about a lot, I think that connection with nature ends up being at the center of so much of spirituality. So in a westernized world where we're often, it's a very secular world, and that has a lot of good things to it. But I think we need to realize there are underlying spiritual connections with something greater than yourself that you need to make to feel kind of healthy. We have kind of those parts of our brain that are tied to that kind of experience. And I think communing with nature is one of those experiences. You're connecting with the great natural world that has birthed us all. And I think that's such a great thing for our secular world, to have a spiritual connection that is outside of, institutions that we might all not agree with. Maybe we don't agree with what book to believe in, but we can agree that the awe-inspiring virtues of nature kind of instill some of that connection in us.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I heard someone describe it as the church of the forest, But yeah, I mean, another thing is to sort of recognize that you're not alone. I think that's been a big personal development for me, and it's something that's not always easy to talk about. Something that a lot of people might not necessarily, people might snigger, people might be very sort of skeptical about. But I think the more time that you spend out in nature, the more that you realize. I used to think that I was getting headspace if I went out there on my own. Right. But then as time has passed, I've realized, well, yeah, I'm getting the headspace, but I'm not alone. This is a community of living things. They might not be human. Right. I'm in a community here, and it's quite a welcoming space too. Still, I think that's something that I'm still getting to grips with, but it's a good feeling anyway.
Absolutely. It's being connected to that big natural world. My partner calls it being held by the mother. You kind of feel like you're part of
Gaia.
So, yeah, exactly. So, and as, I don't know what I would say, as kind of woo-woo as this might sound, once you get out there, you feel it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is that feeling people are talking about. So that's why I always encourage people, just get out there. Before you know it, you'll be a bohemian living in a van, going out into the woods, like joining the Church of the Forest, and you realize how amazing it is. So I guess just kind of circling back to a little bit more practical side of foraging there in Scotland, besides chanterelles, what are some of the other great mushrooms that you find in Scotland?
We have absolutely fantastic habitats here for seps, the Boletus edulis. Okay. I don't know what the common, do you call it the king bolete over there?
King bolete, porcini, seps, all those things.
Yeah. So depending who I'm speaking to, if I'm speaking to an Italian, I say porcini and the eyes light up, Yeah. And I've heard stories. I don't know if it's true. I've not met Italians that are that have actually come here on holiday to hunt for porcini, but I've heard that it's true. And of course, there are some quite heavy restrictions on porcini hunting in Italy.
I would imagine.
Yeah, everybody wants them, right? So you have to have a license, a certain weight you can't go over, and so on. So that for me is a particularly exciting time because we're quite northerly, and because it's a bit colder here, and because the soil's quite acidic. There are certain species that we just don't get lucky on. I don't find morels, so I have to go through that springtime of jealousy when I'm seeing other people posting their pictures of morels that they find in wood chip outside supermarkets, This seems to really big in the UK. I don't find the springtime St. George's mushrooms, and I don't really find black trumpets. But, you have to get it into perspective. We're so lucky. There's an absolutely beautiful bolete, very closely related to the sep or the porcini, called Boletus pinophyllus. It's a big species in Scandinavian countries, which have fairly similar habitats to where I am, really. Lots of conifer, very acidic soil. It's called the pinophyllus, which is pine, so it's the pine sep. And it's a beautiful mushroom. I think a lot of the enjoyment of finding them is just how beautiful they are. Very chunky, kind of like knobbly rustic caps, very red cap. But even so, the difference between that and Boletus edulis can be quite subtle. So it took me a few years to really feel confident that and it tastes just as good, if not better. So that's one that I get particularly excited about.
Wow. Well, and in my area, we do have such a big Italian population where I am around the
Right.
San Francisco Bay Area, that porcini is a huge focus of a lot of foragers around here.
Right.
And similarly, there is now a lot of state parks in California. You have a limit. You can hunt up till, but some areas you have to be licensed. Some areas you're not allowed to do it at all. So I guess in Scotland there, do you guys have any restriction on the amount of mushrooms you can pick?
Not so much. So the kind of legal situation is that you are legally entitled to forage plants and mushrooms from anywhere that you have a right of access to. And we're lucky in Scotland, because in Scotland we have a lot of wilderness, for one thing, a lot of forests. But we also have this right to roam legislation. I can't remember quite when that came in, but some time ago, which gives us more rights to access land than our neighbours down in England, for example. So as long as you can say that what you foraged is for your own family and your own table,
Right.
then you're fine. It gets complicated with roots. So legally, you're not supposed to take the roots of plants unless you have landowner permission. You might want to do that in some cases. So that an example I'll give you is a plant called wood avens. Another common name is clove root, which gives you an idea of where I'm going with this. It's got this amazing kind of cinnamony, clovey kind of flavor in the root. Wow. I make syrup out of that and then put it into cocktails and things like that.
That sounds amazing.
You can do all kinds of things with it. Pig nuts, which are a member of the carrot family, which are like little, they have these little bobbly, almost nut things on the end of the root. There's various, certain roots that you might want to use in making various kind of like an amaro or a vermouth or an absinthe or something like that, sort of botanicals. So in those cases, then you need landowner permission. You also need landowner permission if you're foraging for commercial purposes. So if you're foraging in volumes where you're going to be providing that to restaurants, for example.
Sure.
It gets a little bit, obviously there are lots of grey areas around this. Like, is anybody really going to give the old lady down at the jumble sale a hard time because she's selling some jam? That where she picked some raspberries from the bush. So I think it's not really something that's massively enforced or frowned upon or a problem in Scotland. But in England, there have been a few more problems in recent years, especially around people. We've even had a couple of cases where people have been prosecuted for their harvests and so on.
Oh, wow. Well, that's definitely interesting. I'd imagine on the continent of Europe, too, that there must be more restrictions. You just referenced Italy. I know in Poland, I believe they had some restrictions placed on mushroom hunting. So it is something that I think as foraging culture grows, people are becoming more cognizant of, is the need to make sure not everything's getting taken out of the woods in a way where it can't be later restored or won't come back.
Right. So this is a sort of debate that comes up a lot in these foraging circles.
Absolutely. I was hoping we get to this because I would love to hear your viewpoint on that debate of sustainability.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, as for my own sake, but also as a member of the Association of Foragers, we have a code of conduct which we teach to people about sustainable foraging, and we say that we don't need to take everything. We have to leave something behind. There are cases when it's clearly not. You use your judgment, but at the same time, in the last few years, there's been a lot of criticism of foragers. Even just a kind of medium-sized basket full of different mushrooms, and people can be criticized for that. But there's not really any decent sort of peer-reviewed scientific evidence to suggest that picking mushrooms in those kinds of quantities is harmful for the mycelium. So what we have is, it's often referenced, it's a 18-year study, I think it was, where they took different regions of a forest and gave them different kind of footfalls and different amounts of picking, and were able to sort of conclude that heavy picking of mushrooms has no implication for future fruiting.
Wow.
Now, obviously, this is different in the case of a very rare species of fungus. There's is it Hericium, if I'm saying that correctly, the lion's mane.
Yeah.
I think it probably grows quite abundantly in the States, but in the UK it's really rare. So that's protected legally. There's even a case in the New Forest, I think, where there's kind of like a cage almost been built around this tree where it grows. So that's different, but I suppose also cultural differences and misunderstandings come into play here. Because I mentioned a couple of people had been prosecuted or kind of taken to court because of having a couple of bags full of mushrooms, right?
Right.
I think in at least one of these two cases, we're talking about an Eastern European person. Eastern Europeans are amazing mushroom hunters. It's part of their, it's part of their heritage. Yeah. And those are really countries where this is passed down from generation to generation. And that kind of appreciation and knowledge of wild food has not been lost, like I would argue that it has here, which I think is also part of the problem. And so if you're a ranger of the forest and you see someone with a huge bag of mushrooms, which have probably been picked over a large area fairly sustainably, but it looks quite alarming, it looks like a lot. The instant reaction is, you're commercial foraging, you don't have permission, you have so many mushrooms there, you must be planning to supply those to a restaurant. But in actual fact, that woman argued, no, I'm going to pickle them. I'm going to dry them. These are going to feed my family. I'm going to be sending bags of dried mushrooms back to my grandmother. These are going to feed my family for the next at least year.
Yeah.
And so it's just not understanding other people's cultural practices and kind of what's behind all that, I think, I know for myself that if, certain species of mushrooms will have a short window, I might pick quite a lot of them and come back and dry them and pickle them and so on. But they'll come back just as strong the next year, in my experience.
And this is something that's set against the backdrop, at least the classical backdrop of the UK in general being a rather mycophobic culture, describing, the detestable toadstools and that kind of thing. So, they wouldn't have that same appreciation of the forager's mindset or the forager's culture. Any of us who do forage wild food, wild mushrooms, that obviously, like you're saying, there's a season. You take way more than you would eat that week or that month, and you dry them, you pickle them, you save them for later. So, I can see how in a culture that may, fear mushrooms, kind of classically be quite mycophobic, they wouldn't understand that mindset. But I guess, is that shifting at all in the UK now? I mean, obviously there's some of these prosecutions that highlights the difference, but is the understanding of foraging culture shifting in the UK? Is it growing?
I know that there's been a lot of good efforts on behalf of the foraging community. Some people who are really good at kind of speaking to the media and kind of making their voices heard to try and counter some of the more kind of shady arguments that are being made. So, for example, again, this is the extreme. This is an extreme, but in the New Forest, there was an attempt to ban mushroom picking, which is not legal. They eventually had to hold their hands up and say, "Yeah, we have to withdraw this ban."
And what is the New Forest? Just so I know the difference.
Sorry, yeah. So the New Forest's in the south of England, really right down at the bottom. Okay. And it's just a huge area of mixed woodland, quite a lot of oak and beech and conifer. It's beautiful. It's famous for its ponies. It has these wild, kind of herds of wild ponies wandering about. And there's also little pigs. I don't know what the history of the pigs are, but you can sometimes get followed by a group of pigs when you're foraging. So
it's a magical forest full of ponies and pigs. All right, I want to check this out.
Yeah, you should. You should.
and probably good mushrooms with oaks and conifers there. Oh,
great mushrooms, but forages, which I'm not used to. So where I live up here, I mean, in the last few years, I've started to meet some more foragers out there. Again, they all seem to be Eastern European because more Eastern European people are moving to Aberdeen in the last few years. And it's great to see other foragers out there, but I'm not used to it. Because for all these years, I've been the only one, it's been a really kind of solitary thing. partly because, like you say, this mycophobia, this kind of loss of the foraging culture, which is on the rise, I believe. But you go to the New Forest and it's full of people with baskets. It's, you just look over there, there's another group over there and then over there, and people are kind of running about and can I get over there before they do?
Right, right. The competition comes in.
Yeah, so it's a different experience. And I suppose I can understand the point of view of the Forestry Commission, who see this so much and think, oh, we have to clamp down, the mushrooms are under threat. But just going back to that thing about sustainability, I mean, even in that case, there are so many parts of that forest and that habitat that you can't get to, that are off the beaten track, that even if on a woodland walk, all the mushrooms that are visible get picked, they're only going to be the tip of the iceberg in terms of that mycelium anyway. So
well, that's always been what I fall back on is, the myceliums, that vegetated mass underground, that root system. I mean, it stretches, typically it's such a larger area in terms of square footage than what we see in fruiting bodies. I've always been told, and maybe it's just by the foragers that I talk to, veteran foragers, said you picking the mushrooms is not harming the mycelium. Now there are arguments about cutting them versus just pulling them out of the ground. I guess, where do you fall on that? Do you think that pulling them out of the ground is really damaging the mycelium? Because I've often been told that it's critical with certain mushrooms to pull it out of the ground to see if it comes from a bulb, to see if the foot stains. Like in the case of agaricus, is the foot staining? So do you think that damages it any more than just cutting it off?
Well, okay, I think that in this case, you've raised a really good point, which is safety. So amanitas, for example, you absolutely, if you're fairly new to foraging, you might think you have an agaricus species, but if you have cut it and you haven't looked right at the base of that stipe, you might be missing the vulva, the sac that an amanita would grow out of. It's a mistake you don't want to make. I mean, some amanitas are edible. It's not something I teach on my courses, which are aimed at beginners for sure. But so from a safety point of view, it's important to get the very base of the stipe. I've heard it said, and I don't know if there's any truth in this, that if you cut the stipe, then that gives some sort of vegetative matter which can rot down and cause damage to the mycelium. Interesting. Wow. I don't know if that's true. The way I think of it is, my understanding, is that the mushroom is the fruiting body, like an apple or a berry. And plants and fungi, they produce these things for a reason. They want their seed to be spread. So actually taking those mushrooms and moving them, as long as you have a good basket that's got there's holes in it, and that there's opportunities for those spores to spread about as you walk around, then you're actually doing the job that another kind of animal might do. And I say that because we are also animals, I think that's another thing that gets forgotten often when people assume we shouldn't be in the forest stealing food from the animals. So
right.
That's another soapbox and a tangent. But moving those fruiting bodies around and moving the seeds around is a good thing.
I tend to think the same thing, but obviously, there is kind of I don't know what I want to say, but there is kind of that underlying thought that this can't be sustainable. If you're taking them off, you're ripping them out of the ground, it can't be sustainable. So I'm not surprised that from a forestry and a legislative perspective, they would try to say, okay, we're not going to do that in this beautiful new forest full of little baby pigs and baby ponies. We're not going to destroy the mushroom habitat. So maybe, getting more definitive answers, aside from the one 16 or 18-year study you mentioned, getting more definitive answers on how does picking affect the mycelial mass may help a lot to having kind of the institutional side of forestry understand that foraging isn't something that should be legislated. You're not damaging anything in the ecosystem necessarily. So I guess in just that tale of the legalization, you said they had to repeal that. They couldn't keep people from foraging in the new forest?
Yeah. So I think their argument was always, as I understand it, I mean, I'm obviously based up in Scotland where things are a lot more relaxed.
Right.
There are less foragers overall, apparently. But obviously those areas down there, there are more people. they're more heavily populated areas. It's the south of England compared to rural Aberdeenshire. So we have to remember that as well, you know. There's more wilderness per person up here. But the Forestry Commission argued that they were only trying to prevent commercial foraging, that's all they were ever trying to do. But unfortunately, some representatives of that organization had spoken to the press, and there's this kind of mythical image that gets perpetuated on the more negative side, which is this white van unfortunately full of, according to this myth, Eastern European people that jump out of the back of a white van with bags and they pick everything indiscriminately, and then they go back to some warehouse and they throw out all the stuff that's not edible. There's no evidence that this ever happened. Nobody's ever seen this white van, and all of these people, Eastern Europeans are expert mushroom foragers. Why would they pick things that aren't edible? So there's so much already wrong with that picture. But when you go and say that to the press, then, you know, if you go and dig around on Google, you'll find articles every autumn since this all kicked off, talking about Eastern Europeans taking too much from the forest. And it's a horrible, damaging image. And you would think something like that, something quite racist really, would arise in such a beautiful thing, which is foraging. But unfortunately, it's there too. And I'm hoping, I know we're going to talk about the research in a little bit, but I'm hoping that that's the kind of thing that can be that my research can turn on its head and cause people to reflect on properly and question. Yeah.
I think that's going to be incredibly important, especially when interfacing with institutions that really should be working with foragers. I mean, it would be great to see something like a Foragers Association full of people who are extremely knowledgeable about wild foods, working hand in hand with the Forestry Service to like teach kids about foraging and thereby stewardship of this amazing forest and basically food bank that we have all around us. So yes, well, I really want to dive into what you've been researching thus far and kind of what your plans are, because I think it is really interesting to answer some of these questions that we're just postulating about right now. We all have anecdotal stories and our own assumptions and takeaways, but it would be great to get some objective research into the phenomenon of, you know, foraging and how damaging is it or not. And I think that's really important. But just because I know it sounds like the Eastern European culture is what's been especially kind of targeted, as you're the mushroom hunters, you're the foragers. Classically, they are seen, you know, even here, they're seen as like the best mushroom foragers, probably because they are. But is there a native, or was there ever a native kind of UK forage tradition or Scottish forage tradition? You may not be, you know, the history buff on all this stuff, but I just was curious if that was something that was present in England and Scotland that has kind of been lost over time.
Yeah, well, you know what, I think it was. And one example I can give you was a village. It's about a 10-minute drive from here, called Lumsden. Mm-hmm. And if you then drive a further, 30 minutes towards Murrayshire, which is towards the kind of the northeast coast, you will find a big factory, a big food producer company called Baxter's. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they make tinned soups, jars of chutneys and pickles and so on. They've been around for years, you know, a bit like Campbell's soup, that kind of thing. And a few years ago, I was doing a research project. You know, I'm a social scientist. I'm also interested in rural communities and so on. So we were doing this storytelling project with the people of Lumsden. And Lumsden is quite a typical rural village for this part of the world. It's full of a lot of older people. The young people don't necessarily always stay in these rural areas, which is another conversation for another day. So the storytelling project really became this kind of project about heritage, about people's stories from when they were younger, and painted this incredibly vivid picture of what rural life had been like in this village. Now the village doesn't even have a shop, but you know, when these 80-year-old people were in their 20s, there was a butchers, a bakers, and a candlestick makers. I know that's a cliche, but there was literally everything that you could imagine in the days before the supermarket, you know? And this story that came up a few times was this story about this malevolent gamekeeper who... So each of these rural areas tends to have one country estate that's owned by the local landowner. There's a big house, they own a lot of the land, and in those days controlled quite a lot of the local families and their work and so on.
Sure, kind of almost
But
a classical medieval or a feudal almost throwback in terms of like the manor house, the lord, and the people. Yeah,
absolutely like that. Yeah, you'd be surprised at how recent history that actually is as well.
yeah,
But as a means of making a bit more money, a lot of the villagers were selling foraged berries to Baxters, who used to drive around apparently at one point in a horse and cart, which must have taken a long time to get to, if you consider that's half an hour in a car,
right.
and more in the latter part of that period in an old kind of old-fashioned car or van, and collect berries from people. They talk about cranberries. I mean, we find something called lingonberries here, but I think there may have even been species then which are decline or even gone from this area now. So they used to forage raspberries, cranberries, blackberries, and sell them as a little economic enterprise to this local jam chutney producer. And in order to do that, they must have had that kind of knowledge.
Right.
But I think that the modern day forager, I mean, it's partly about food as well, obviously, right? And food is very fashionable and people always want to do something new. And that's good for us foragers who want more people to get connected to the land because it brings more people. It's another motivation that brings other people to it. But I think this modern day forager is exploring new avenues and new foods in new ways, like fermenting things and then dehydrating them and using that powder as a condiment on something, for example.
Yeah. We're seeing some really novel ways of using wild food. A lot of the different treatments people go through. I mean, a quick scroll on Instagram through different wild food chefs and things, you'll just be blown away by how people are transforming these foods into something brand new.
It's amazing that there are so many new ideas that can come from that. But yes, I do believe we had this heritage.
Yeah.
But I think it's been fragmented, it's been lost. I was reflecting a lot recently on why is that? Why is Eastern Europe so much more still connected? I suppose some of those countries had economic crises, which maybe encouraged them to keep foraging. We are an island, so maybe we have more bounty from the sea. And also the UK is fantastic fertile ground for farming. So you have a lot of rain, you have good soil. I mean, maybe all of these things together, plus industrialization and globalization, all together equals a disconnection from foraging knowledge. And then, as you were talking about this mycophobia, this increasing fear in poison, in the poison of the mushroom, which adds to that distance that people put between it. But I'm definitely seeing a revolution, and I don't think it's just about food and fashion. I think it's way more than that. I think that people are looking for new ways to connect back to their natural environments. And it's like you say, people kind of almost feel they need that, but they don't know why. Right. Maybe they'll start looking, what can I get involved in? Maybe foraging, maybe fishing, whatever it might be, to try and deepen that connection.
I see that a lot. I see people seeking some kind of connection, and a connection to like food and finding things. We all love to do treasure hunts. We all like to find things. I think that is an easy way for people to latch on to a connection with nature. And just circling back on what you said about, folks foraging wild berries, I think that definitely hints that there was some kind of legacy of foraging. I think just the fact that Scotland has those kind of free to roam laws where you can roam on property if you're just finding food for your family. I think there are similar things in Scandinavia, kind of foragers' laws, where you can go even on private property to forage, so long as it's just for you and your family. I think that definitely hints at a foraging culture that had been established at one point. And, I think it's interesting to examine those differences between Eastern European culture and then kind of Western, especially anglicized culture, and where they diverged. It may have been that Western anglicized culture kind of went that industrialized supermarket route where suddenly we didn't have to forage in the woods. There was a giant enclosed space where we could forage on shelves. And, I'm sure Eastern Europe has plenty of supermarkets and all that as well, but maybe it didn't take over in the same way that it did in the US and Britain and some of those areas. But this kind of gets into the heart of your research, which, like you said, you're a psychologist, a social scientist, in addition to being a woodsy wild food expert. So what are some of the questions, and maybe we've already highlighted a lot of them, but what are some of the questions you're looking at in your research? And maybe another question, how did it come about? How did you start doing this research? And kind of what is the greater context? Like, what group are you doing this with or for?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a researcher at an institute that's based in Aberdeen. They've also got a site in Dundee called the James Hutton Institute. It used to be years ago called the Macaulay Institute. And James Hutton are really well known for natural sciences to do with agriculture and soil and ecosystems and the environment and natural resources and so on. So already it's an institute that's quite embedded in a lot of those questions. But as I say, a lot of that research is natural physical science. But at James Hutton, we also have this group of social scientists working on exploring behaviors and kind of motivations and kind of economies and so on. So I've been working at the Hutton for a couple of years doing research on rural communities and agriculture and how you support small farmers and the role of technologies for farmers as well. And I think it took a while before I actually clicked that there would be a place for me there to actually start exploring some of the stuff around wild food and foraging too. It's increasingly something that's contributing to these local rural economies where these small businesses start up, whether it's something like what I'm doing or, you know, somebody starting a kind of foraging hedgerow gin. So there's all kinds of different angles that you can look at wild food from. Yeah. And as an area of research, you will find a lot of research that has been done over the past few years, but it's quite fragmented. And quite often when a kind of a strand of research is picked up, it's like a snowball effect and it starts rolling and more people get interested and, you know, as papers are published and so on. But for some reason, it's been a bit more fragmented with wild food. And a lot on the social science side, a lot of the research looked at wild food as a product, as an economic thing. And I think that's definitely important, and it's definitely part of the importance of wild food. I think some of these projects and groups called them non-timber forest products.
That's not very mystical or magical of a name, non-timber forest products. It's quite mundane.
Exactly, and it just sort of seems to boil things down to being about economics at the end of the day. And I have a colleague in Latvia who I may do some research with, who was talking to me, and he said, it's not really about that, is it? It's about people's values and people's practices.
Yeah.
It's not about products. And I said, I think that's right. He said, I think that's why the research keeps just tailing off, because you can only get so far with considering something like that from an economic point of view. So, given the huge diversity of opinion on foraging that I see, whether it's when I speak to people or the stuff in the media or on social media, you know, anything from this quite extreme view of foraging as being something that's kind of almost like desecrating natural spaces where humans don't have a place in nature, to the other end of the extreme, which is this idea of foragers as being ambassadors of natural spaces, you know, and everything in between. And there's definitely a need to do some social science research into trying to understand those different perspectives. But not only that, to actually then maybe bring some of those different types of voices, by which I mean the different kinds of people that have these different opinions, into a space together, and to try and share their perspectives with one another, and maybe to try and come up with some shared understanding. That's my vision, that's my dream for it. Obviously, there can be tension there. You know, for example, conservationists who don't pick plants and fungi for food, perhaps they think foragers are damaging. You know, perhaps it's easy to think, oh, well, that's damaging. We don't have a place there, you know. But actually, we can all be allies. Some of these different stakeholders with different opinions all want the same thing, you know, and that's a strong natural world. And so I think that to try and bring people together, and research is just another avenue, another way that you might do that. It's not the only way, but it's just another kind of I want to say weapon, but I just think that sounds wrong and quite negative.
Well, it's a good vehicle. It's a good vehicle for people to have those conversations. And, I think that is really important. Like I said, with the Forestry Service and the Foragers Association, I mean, having people on different ends of the spectrum who all, at the end of the day, love nature and want to be out in nature, want to connect, want to protect. I think that these are conversations that need to be had, because only by having them and not just, having them in comment sections of social media, but having a longer discourse in the context of research or the context of a deeper conversation, then you come to some kind of understanding and people find mutual ground.
Oh, maybe there are some bad experiences that people have had that cause them to feel negatively about it. For example, why people working for the Forestry Commission in Scotland, you were saying you had this vision of the Forestry Commission working with foragers to educate children and so on. That actually does happen in some parts of the UK. But it's a big organisation with lots of different people, and I suppose having a coherent policy, or maybe there's, maybe things are different in different parts of the country, and that's why there isn't a coherent policy. But to just try and understand where people are coming from to begin with, I think is an important thing.
Yeah, it's important to understand what everyone's viewpoint is, really, the stories behind that, to really understand and make it a little more depolarized, as you can kind of step into their shoes and see the argument from the other side. So I think that kind of research is going to open a lot of doors and is going to really kind of empower the foraging community in a big way, and probably, if anything, encourage more people to not be so entrenched in their different viewpoints and to really come from a place of trying to connect. We always say this, where the point of communication is either to bring us closer together or push us further apart. So having more context for communication that brings us together is always a good thing. And I think for me, what some of what you're talking about with conservationists not wanting to pick things, it highlights kind of this general sense. I think there's a little bit of a divide between people that see us as separate from nature and kind of like a virus on nature. And then there are people that see us as part of nature. And, that doesn't give us carte blanche to do whatever we want to nature, where, well, we're part of nature, so if we destroy it to build a factory, that's okay. I don't go that far, but we are part of nature and we can interact with natural settings. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're like tarnishing them or doing something bad to them.
And actually, despite me saying, I think that you can pick a lot of mushrooms and not do damage, of course, as foragers, we have our kind of immediate spaces that we tend to forage in that are near to our homes and whatnot. Right. And we want to protect those spaces, and we feel connected to them. And we will, we won't pick all of that one plant because we know that's going to be damaging to that plant, that kind of thing.
Sure.
We might become spokespeople for those places, for example, or realize through bad experiences that maybe we need to. For example, I had this forest that I was very fond of, very attached to, and it was clear felled a couple of years ago. I turned up to go for a walk there, not in mushroom season, and I felt fairly heartbroken, actually.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that one is that it was a spruce forest, so probably Forestry Commission, a crop essentially. So a lot of these non-native forests that are planted as forestry, the trees are planted very close together. They're not very easy places to walk, apart from the tracks that go through them. Not the easiest places to forage. But some of them are a bit different. So this one was planted with the trees quite widely apart. There were lots of beautiful little pathways going through it. I found a red datalist mushroom, which is, legally protected species of mushroom. If only I'd known them. And various kind of interesting species of plants, and there were badger sets in there. So it's interesting because people tend to think non-native equals bad, and sometimes it is. Sometimes it's invasive and it competes with the native wildlife. But in this case, we had a really beautiful forest that was quite a special place, and it was a thriving ecosystem despite being this what people often consider to be a monoculture.
Right.
It wasn't.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing that it opens your eyes to, not just because my mushrooms were lost, which they were, obviously.
That was no small part, probably.
No small part in my emotional reaction, I'm sure, but what about the badger sets? What about the birds that live there?
Yeah.
So what about that red data list species of mushroom that I found gone?
Yeah, and it's funny. I had something similar happen with one of the foragers here where I live in Marin County, where there was basically a stand of oaks that ended up getting cut down. There was like a great chanterelle spot, which oaks to me are like one of the most magical trees. They're amazing.
Yeah.
We should revere them. No one should be allowed to touch them. I think it was honestly they were on a ridge line, and it might have been landowners wanting a better view or something.
Okay.
I forget the exact reason, but something so stupid like that. Yeah, something that clearly you guys aren't foragers. If we could show you what grew around these trees, you would not cut them down.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we've kind of covered a really huge swath of foraging culture, a lot of big topics that I think are really important. But now bringing it back to Leanne and what you do in the forest, I wanted to make sure we cover Wild Food Story and what you're doing, taking people out in the woods, and what your workshops are like. I guess, when did you start feeling comfortable enough to take people out? And then how do you get these groups together? How do you bring people together?
Yeah, it's quite a leap from being a confident forager to feeling that you're ready to take people out and teach them. I had the kind of mentorship in a way of people from my extended community, which were initially online and then became people that I knew in the real world. So, some of my foraging friends encouraged me and said, you're ready, you're ready, you can teach now. By that point, I was already taking out friends and family, and more people were asking. And I thought, I could actually do something with this. And at that time, I was working at the University of Aberdeen when that all really kicked off. And I was on fixed-term research contracts, which is quite a common thing for researchers. It's quite an unsettled career when you're an early career researcher, and you're waiting for that kind of coveted lectureship, which in many cases you can only get, by the way, by sort of moving around the country or even abroad. But we're very settled where we live because my husband's got a gardening business here, which is well established, and so on. So at that time, my contracts were getting smaller and smaller, and I had less work, so I had more time to spend in the forest. And I thought, I can develop this business. And and only then did the perfect job at the James Hutton come up, by the way, which was full-time, of course.
Right.
And because I'm quite a stubborn person, I just thought, nope, not prepared to give it up. I can't not take this amazing research position, which is permanent pretty much, and has my name all over it.
Sure.
But at the same time, I've come too far with this, and I'd already started to develop the idea of doing the courses. So it was born, and I'm a very busy person now. But my courses, I generally run from spring to autumn. And the typical course is the one where I take a group of people out into the woods or the riverside or whichever habitat. We'll probably do about 2 hours of foraging, and I introduce people to the principles of it. Obviously, the safety aspect of identification and what's important to do and not do. Stuff around the kind of... I'm called Wild Food Stories, so I quite like stories and all of that. So maybe some stories about how things were used. And then after we've covered quite a few species, we tend to come back and have a picnic or some kind of feast. And that's really important because it brings people together and kind of that sense of community. But at the same time, it's really important because it displays the different things that you can do with the wild food. Until then, it might be a little bit abstract how you actually turn this into something that goes onto the table. And for me, preservation is quite a big thing too, because as we talked about earlier, you capture these harvests in their short windows. And unless you just want to eat something fresh a few times and then it's gone, you need to learn how to preserve, whether that's pickling, preserving in sugar, alcohol, dehydration, and so on. So the picnics tend to have elements in them that showcase all of that kind of different preservation approaches too. In the last few years, I've done some different kinds of work as well. I've done a bit of consultancy work. I've done workshops for companies like whiskey distilleries. who tend to fly bartenders from different parts of the world and want to show them interesting things that'll kind of get them thinking in a new way. And so foraging is great for bartenders. There are so many different applications for wild cocktails and things like that. You might see a few cocktails on my Instagram feed now and then.
Yeah.
So, and then there's going to be workshops on preservation this year. Yeah. So it's really quite broad.
It sounds like it. And I think covering all these areas is so important, especially the preservation part. I have so many people ask me, what do you do with all those mushrooms you find? It's really important to show people all the different methods of preservation. And I think that does give people a much better visualization of, if you're going to start foraging, get familiar with, the practical side of it and how to store all these amazing finds. You dove into wild food and foraging. And this is something I believe so much, that when you have a passion about something and you just dive in, it's funny how everything else in your life, like the resources avail themselves to you. And suddenly you find yourself being able to shape things around this passion. And I mean, in your case, you're now doing consultancies on wild food. You're leading wild food courses. You happen to have an opportunity to now take your great research position and direct it toward wild food. It's just really cool to see how you've taken that, something you were so passionate about, and being able to turn it into really your life's work.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I want to do. I think that, I'd be lying if I denied that. Over the years, there's been things that have interested me for periods of time. And for the first few years of foraging, my husband was absolutely convinced it was going to be a phase,
Right.
But it's not a phase. I've been grabbed by it and it won't let go. And that's going to be with me for the rest of my life now. Do you know what's so magical, I think, about mushrooms and plants? There's no way you could ever get bored because of the seasons. So, if photography was with me for a while, and I still try and apply a bit of that to sharing the love of these dishes and these plants and so on. But, with the seasons, things come and they go, and then you have this wait, and that builds a kind of anticipation and a frustration and everything. There's no way that this could ever be a phase, It's
Right.
It's
Right.
seasonal. There's always something coming and going and something to look forward to. So, but yeah, I can see myself doing this for a long time. I already want to write a book, possibly even an academic book on the kind of the different perspectives and cultures, as well as a book more practically about preservation and cooking with wild foods and so on. So there are many, many plans and avenues. I don't think you could ever get bored of this. So,
There's infinite amounts to learn, especially something I want to get better at is wild plant foraging. Having spoken with a lot of wild food foragers, it just seems like the next natural step. It's like mushroom foraging. It's daunting at first until you get in the woods with other people, especially people that know their stuff. You start finding things you really understand. Then on a cellular level, when you find it and pick it, it becomes much easier to learn. So it's something I definitely want to get into. But like you were saying, these cycles of foraging, like for me, it's right now, it's just the mushroom season. They become embedded in your life. It doesn't really become a fad because there is such anticipation when it's not mushroom season. Then when it is, you go out every second that you can, and then it's not. And then, so, I mean, it becomes like this cyclical thing in your life that gets embedded. So it is very easy to make it a lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it becomes part of the fabric of who you are. I think that there's something really kind of elemental about, we were probably all so finely tuned into the seasons, weren't we, once upon a time? And that can be quite difficult. The seasons seem to blur a little bit now. Maybe it's climate change. I'm no scientist. I don't know. But we still have just about the different seasons. So, yeah, I think it's important to be connected to that.
Yeah, it's interesting that the seasons do have kind of an elemental effect, even on my personality. So, I think folks do get more tuned into that, and it's probably something that we had a much deeper connection with, like foraging at one time.
Yeah.
So, as we're coming in just about an hour now, I want to just get an idea. When is your research going to be completed, do you think? And then is that going to be published through the Hutton Institute, or where will that show up for people?
Yeah, so I think that if, let's say maybe about 6 months from now, I should have some nice data that starts to paint a bit more of a picture. My plan obviously I'd like to publish that in an academic sense and establish myself within this field in that sense. Maybe there's a journal, I think, People in Nature, which sounded particularly, relevant for that kind of thing. So there are various journals that might be appropriate. And like I was saying, when you look at wild food, which angle do you take? There's we already talked about the economic aspect. There's wild food as tourism. There's wild food as sort of cultural practices. So all of those different areas would have different home journals that might be relevant. So it really just depends how much time I've got. This is still it's only one strand of the work that I'm doing on a daily basis, and I've got other projects that I'm leading on that I need to deliver work on and so on.
Right.
But I'd also like to try and get that work out to a broader audience, and that's something that's increasingly important in academic research anyway. It's a real big push. It's all about what they call impact, We don't want scholars who are just sitting up in their kind of palaces writing difficult to understand papers that only other scholars are going to read. We want research that actually makes a difference and that has a message which can be useful to someone in the real world. So that means writing blog posts, it means going out into communities and talking to people and doing public engagement activities and so on. So hopefully, a good range of different outlets to share the findings of this research.
Yeah. Now, where can people find out more about you, find out more information? Let's go over, Instagram, websites, all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So on Instagram, I'm at Wild Food Story. And then, unfortunately, someone had already nabbed Wild Food Stories because that's my actual business name. So my website is wildfoodstories.co.uk. And I also have a page which you can easily find on Facebook, Wild Food Stories. And these are outlets for me to sort of just share, get people interested in the world of wild food and drink, and share some ideas and recipes and so on. And also, obviously, my events can be found on my website. And in time, I'm going to put a page within my website about the research as well, so we'll be able to find out how that's unfolding there.
Well, I really do encourage people to follow you, because not only do you have great pictures, great information, inspiring kind of approachable takes on wild food foraging, but coupled that with some of this really interesting social science research, I think you're definitely kind of like this fountain of a lot of great information about wild food. So I definitely encourage people to follow you, especially if you're in Scotland or in England. Sign up for some classes, go out hunting, because you just seem like you'd be fun to go out in the woods with. And I was going to move to just a couple questions, and this kind of ties in with that. What is a story you might tell on some of your forage trips, maybe about a mushroom that you like and a use for it? It doesn't have to be a favorite or anything like that, but just a mushroom that you find, like a chanterelle or a sep, and something cool, historical, or a use of it.
Okay, so well, it's not something that I recommend necessarily as a food, depending on your particular approach to this. But
sure.
One of the things that people find quite interesting is a lot of the kind of the mythology and the stories and the folklore around the fly agaric mushroom, the Amanita muscaria.
Yes.
Probably familiar with some of these stories as well. So we talk about its potential connection to Christmas. So how, for example, in Mongolia, it was prized by the village elder or the shaman, who would take the fly agaric mushroom, which you and I know is a deliriant mushroom.
Yes.
It's got some kind of psychoactive properties to it, right? And so a tea or an extraction of this mushroom would be taken by the elder of the village to induce perhaps some visions which might help him to make decisions and to be the manager of this community. And because it was highly prized, the villagers would pick the mushrooms so that representatives of this shaman could easily come past the branches of the trees and collect them. So spruce trees tend to grow with very low branches, so it involves crawling under the tree, hence your kind of villager or peasant, however this would have been described then, would be the person picking the mushrooms rather than the shaman or his immediate people. And once the mushrooms had been picked, they were placed on the branches of the spruce tree. And so you would be able to see all of these spruce trees with these beautiful decorations of these red and white spotty mushrooms on them. So this is the first thing that I've heard tales whereby this might be the origin of decorating a Christmas tree.
Yeah. That's a very cool origin of decorating the Christmas tree. I hope that's true. And I've heard similar stories, but I never heard this kind of coming out of Mongolia for the shop. That's really interesting. Good. I wanted to get a slice of what it is like to walk the woods with Leanne as she shares her knowledge of all the amazing fungi out there. And then along these lines, on the edible side, what's an edible mushroom you love and something you make with it generally?
Oh, I suppose my first love is the chanterelle. And
right.
I might get a little bit more excited about other species of mushrooms that I find less frequently, but nothing beats a small basket full of really firm, good chanterelles. And I've tried all kinds of gourmet applications of mushrooms and dishes over the years, but I think my favorite still has to be mushrooms on toast. A really nice slice of crusty bread, sourdough maybe toasted, and some chanterelle, maybe some ceps and other things mixed in there as well, just fried up with some garlic, maybe some herbs from the garden, and just pile that onto toast. A bit of sea salt, black pepper, and I just don't think you can beat it.
That sounds amazing. And for me, with my time, I'm at breakfast time, so I'm quite literally salivating over that. No, that's awesome. And I'm thinking too, a twist on that would Americanize it is like throw some avocado on there, avocado and mushroom toast.
Oh yeah, I might try that now.
There you go. We get maybe inspire some people out there. And then the last question, what's the lasting impact you hope to make with kind of your whole body of work? What's the lasting impact you hope to make on the planet? Pretty big question.
On the planet, wow. Well, if I can have any kind of impact at all, I suppose it's about making people open their eyes and connect. Just what we spoke about previously, whatever route or vehicle people take to find me, I don't care. Like you were saying, they might just like free stuff or treasure. See it like a treasure hunt. However you get there, just get here and let's go out into the forest and you will be changed forever. And because the more people that are changed in that way, that become more in tune, more connected, I feel, especially young people, the more chance our planet has of us being more sensitive and taking a more aware and sensible approach in the future, which might be able to reverse some of the scarring that's happened so far. Fingers crossed, it's not too late, and we can make a difference still.
Never too late, and all those people you're inoculating with an appreciation for foraging and leading that into an appreciation of nature, they're going to inoculate more people. It's kind of the exponential growth that comes when you start doing that and kind of changing people's outlooks and imbuing people with a love of nature. So, well, Leanne, this has been really inspiring. I can't wait to have you back on, especially when you get deeper into this research to kind of see some of the findings. And like you said, that's a conversation. The viewpoints of foraging is a conversation that could span multiple podcasts. So I'm excited to hear more. And, hopefully we're talking about a trip over to the Isles to visit a bunch of different people. So hopefully we'll be able to do that and come pick chanterelles.
Yeah, please do that. You'd be so welcome.
All right, Leanne. Well, thank you so much for the time this morning, for you the afternoon, but thank you so much for the time. And we'll look forward to talking with you again soon.
Speak again soon.